All right.
Bam. All right. All right. Well, let's get started. As long as you're ready, Rich, we'll get going. All right, great. Let me briefly introduce today's seminar. And as we've begun doing, I also want to highlight some recent good news from a member of our KCART research community. Some of you may have seen this within the LSI newsletter, but there was an announcement that Dr. Megan Davidson from Speech, Language and Hearing Department recently was awarded an NIDCD new R21 as of September of 2022. Its focus is on more and less social comprehension, child and text factors for autistic children. So hopefully that's of interest to some folks, but I did want to highlight that work and congratulate Dr. Davidson, who may or may not be here today, but still great accomplishment. Now I can turn to today's seminar, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Richard Yee to our seminar today. Dr. Yee is the director of the Coffin-Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment and professor in the Department of Psychology. He joined our faculty, thankfully, we're very grateful that he's here, in 2018 after spending 3 years at the University of Florida and then previously multiple years at the University of Maryland, where he was faculty. He's had some involvement in autism research in the past, but to be clear, that is not the focus of his work. But this I saw as just a wonderful opportunity. Really, a broader goal of this seminar is to highlight rigorous research that's ongoing within the KU and KU Med Center communities, because I think there's probably a lot of overlapping ideas and methods that all of us could benefit from discussing. So I'm delighted that Rich was able to do this talk and agree to do it. Dr. Yee uses multiple methods to understand mechanisms and therapeutics related to addiction. He employs behavioral economic approaches to look at basic decision making. And then he also looks at how individuals value or devalue delayed outcomes, that is delayed discounting, and its association with addiction, as well as relapse in addiction. He's an associate editor of behavioral processes. He regularly serves as a grant reviewer for NIH and NSF. He's a fellow of APA Division 28. He has an ongoing R01 from NIA, as well as an R34 through NIDA, and he's also co-I on multiple separate NIH awards, including 2 separate R01s. So he's very productive, obviously. I'm delighted that he was able to speak with us today, and he's going to focus on dimensions of psychological distance and evaluation of outcomes today. So thanks for being here, Rich.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to cover. So I have kind of like the funded part of my work. That's stuff that's tends to be funded by the National Institutes of Health, and then I have this kind of other area where I tend to call what I call play. It's like the part where I get to do the stuff where kind of explore the questions that I just really want to explore. So thanks for inviting me, Matt. And it's opportunities like this where I get to talk a little bit more about, given the somewhat implemented forum that kind of speak about this part of my work that I don't generally get to speak about very much, because it's not the part that's typically funded, but it's actually a fun part that I find way more interesting and perhaps more important in the body of work. So hold on, I'm going to kind of take you through a bunch of data, some theory. Hopefully it all makes sense. There's some coherence to this body of work. And what I've tried to do is try to find elements of the stuff that I do that I think might be relevant for people who are interested in autism. That said, my understanding of autism is just a regular guy on the street. And so I fully recognize that it is a very incomplete understanding of autism, but maybe there's something in here that's of interest to you. So the title of my talk is Dimensions of Psychological Distance and Valuation of Outcomes. So the most substantial part of my work is on delayed discounting. So just kind of the introduction of the construct, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, this idea and kind of perhaps its applicability to the real world. is that when we are making decisions for the future, we tend to kind of make what some people might consider the more optimal decision, the decision that's associated with better outcomes. So if you're planning for what you're going to have for tomorrow for dinner, and you're thinking, okay, well, I can have like fruits and vegetables, have some proper salad, something healthy versus a cheeseburger made with a glazed donut as the fun. By the way, for those who don't know, this is called a Luther burger. Apparently, the wife's tale is that it was named after Luther Vandross, and I think my guess is Matt knows who Luther Vandross was, but many of you do not. It might be a little bit before your time. He was an R&B singer, very very famous R&B singer, but his weight fluctuated quite a bit. So at some point,
Seems like it could fluctuate just based on just that one snack.
No, that he was.
That's a real thing.
Yeah, no, it's a thing. It's a thing. Yeah, it's a thing.
That's amazing.
So, cheeseburger with a donut as the thing. In fact, it's kind of old at this point. I mean, people have been doing it for a while. So if you're making those projections, if you're like me, I'm like, okay, well, I like to eat healthy. My preference at this point is that tomorrow I'm going to eat healthy. Okay. 24 hours goes by. Now you're confronted with that decision, right? And so now it's today. Nothing fundamentally has changed regarding that choice structure, right? But you're hungry, right? You've had a long day at work, and now your preference might shift towards having that Luther burger. And so this is kind of like the essential problem some people consider of self-control, which is when there's like the immediate pull of these kind of enticing outcomes, we tend to shift our preference towards the outcome that's a little bit less preferable, even though we might prefer the better outcome when the decision is far away. This might be quantified in kind of most classic way with money situations. If I were to ask you, do you want $95 in 12 months versus $100 in 13 months, right? The difference is $5 in 1 month, right? And when they're both far away, I suspect many of you would say, oh, if I'm going to wait 12 months, I can wait another month. I'll take the $100 in 13 months. Now, 12 months passes by, right? Nothing fundamentally about your financial situation has changed. And so now you're confronted with that same choice. And you say, well, but now it's $95 a day versus $100 a month. So many people switch over to that $95, right? Even though, once again, the difference remains $5 in 1 month. So the paradigm that I use to explore this phenomena is these monetary choice paths of delayed discounting. And delayed discounting refers to simply this idea that when you have to wait for something, it loses its subjective value, right? It loses its effect on your behavior, and its value is less. And so that all things being equal, we prefer things now compared to later. And the way we do that with the monetary choice task is up on the upper right here, you see we offer people a binary choice task. You want $50 now or $100 in a week, right? So some variation of that, where the choice is between a small amount of money now, a large amount of money later. We have some variations, many variations of these types of questions. And then for each delay, for $100 that's delayed by a week, a month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, you can calculate what's called an indifference point, which is what's the point at which theoretically you are indifferent between a small amount of money now and $100 that's delayed by X delay. Right? And so if we plot that on our x-axis, we have the delays to the $100. On our y-axis, we have that indifference point as a proportion of the $100. Right? You get these data points. This is hypothetical data, right? And then what we sometimes do is we try to come up with a mathematical function that explains that monotonically decreasing trend. And there is no right model, right? But they're ones that seem to work pretty well. And so this hyperbolic model is the one that that in psychology that we kind of decided that seems to work the best. And so what you end up doing is using nonlinear regression to estimate this value K. And the value K is the rate of delayed discounting, where higher values indicate a steep loss of subjective value as a function of delay, right? So the line drops down really quickly, right? And that means that when you have to wait for something, you just don't want to wait, and you rather have it now. And a lower value of K indicates a shallow rate of delayed discounting. The line stays up fairly high, and these are presumably it's indicative of the ability to wait or delay gratification. Delayed discounting is a is a very popular topic in addictions research. I think for a few reasons beyond the evidence base, right? So there's been a lot of studies looking at substance use um, and delayed discounting, and maybe use it even as a potential mechanism of substance use and perhaps even recovery. If you look at the various definitions of addiction that you see for substance use disorder that you see with NIDA, with the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the American Psychiatric Association, with the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they all have some element of the definition that talks about, oh, I want to do this, but I end up doing this, right? So I want the better thing to be in the future, but when confronted with the choice, I switch and I engage in substance. So so my training was with Howard Racklin, and there was a number of the behavioral scientists that were working on delayed discounting before it became kind of popular with the substance use world, have this really, to me, interesting kind of theory as it relates to what's happening with delayed discounting, right? And one way of thinking about delayed discounting is that the reason people's preferences change over time, right? The reason I say tomorrow I'm going to have fruits and vegetables, but when tomorrow comes, I have the Luther burger, is that I am different people at each moment in time, right? So in other words, I have experiences, and so I am not the exact same person tomorrow that I am today, right? And that's a really interesting idea, because what it supposes is that when I'm making a decision about what I'm going to eat tomorrow, I'm not making a decision for myself. I'm making a decision for some variation of myself that will exist tomorrow, right? And then when tomorrow comes, I am not the Rich Yi of yesterday. I'm the Rich Yi of that moment, because of all the little things that have changed. Our cells have changed, our experiences have changed. So to me, I think this is a really, really interesting idea. Racklin, George Ainsley, these are the first people to think about it. In fact, some fantastic philosophers have talked about this, and what they're talking about is that when we make decisions, we're not the same person. We are different people, and that is perhaps a part of why our preferences might change, right? That leads to this interesting idea, right? So that if across time we are different people, then when we are making a choice for ourselves in the future, we are making a choice for a different person, right? A slightly different, only a very slightly different person, but a different person nonetheless. If you could translate this idea to not myself at different points in time, but at one point in time, different selves, right? You can map this idea onto this idea of, well, what if I have to make a choice between myself and someone who's at some, as opposed to intertemporal distance from me, an interpersonal distance from me, right? So for example, my parents, my kids, if the Venn diagram of my identity, they overlap significantly, right? But then as you get further and further, good friends, then professional colleagues, then the person that I don't really know, the complete stranger who's half a world away. These all represent personal or interpersonal distances, right? And we can map onto that same idea, and we might be able to gain some insight into our behavior as it relates to other people by taking the same paradigms, right? And so what we're doing is, when we're making decisions in this domain, we're making choices between ourselves versus others in the interpersonal space, and in the intertemporal space, it's ourselves now versus ourselves later, who's a different person. And so Javi Racklin has proposed a social discounting paradigm where it's basically the same thing, but instead of the outcome being delayed, the outcome is for somebody else, and you have to specify some interpersonal distance, and it's somewhat imperfect way of doing it. But right now, what's been done is they say, well, think of 100 people that you know and kind of rank order them in terms of how close you feel to them, right? And then so you can ask the same types of delayed discounting questions, but say, okay, do you want $100 for your best friend, or do you want $50 for yourself? And then once again, the idea is that because it's for somebody else, it's somewhat discounted. You titrate this value for yourself, and then you can come up with a present self, a subjective value for the self that's equivalent to some outcomes for the others. And what that research has shown is that you can model the same type of hyperbolic mathematical function, where instead of this value, this discount rate, delayed discount rate K as the index of discounting, you have this social discount rate S as the rate of social discounting. And so this has been proposed as perhaps a way to study Some people will say altruism, right? To the extent that this maps onto altruism, there's kind of different philosophical arguments about what altruism is, right? But the thought that I had, which has kind of led me into some of this work, is number one, identifying overlap between delayed discounting and social discounting, and then is it possible that there's something to be gained here from using this social discounting task to understand something like autism, which once again, from a very kind of naive perspective, right? The thought that I have is that there is some sort of social or interpersonal deficit, right? Empathy or something along those lines. Once again, grossly oversimplified. I apologize. A post-baccalaureate student that I work with eventually went and got his PhD in neuroscience. And while he was in grad school, he wanted to look at social discounting. So this is a study where he was at Virginia Tech, and he was looking at the congruence of neural signals associated with doing a social discounting task versus a temporal discounting task. What he found was not perfect congruence, which I think is perfectly reasonable, right? Somewhat problematically, there's no clear behavioral congruence, meaning individuals who have high rates of delayed discounting don't necessarily have high rates of social discounting, right? So they're not behaviorally correlated necessarily, but there appear to be some congruence in kind of the brain regions that are activated when individuals are making decisions between outcomes that are delayed and when they're making decisions between outcomes for other folks. Okay, so I'm not a neuroscientist. I helped out a little bit. You guys can obviously read it and tell me which one is this one. Then while I was at the University of Maryland, I worked, kind of collaborated on a single project with Elizabeth Redcave, who I believe I think you know, I chatted about her at one point. And so I approached that because I wanted to explore this idea of social discounting. And what led me into this idea was having conversations with Elizabeth and some others. This was probably about 5 years ago, was that there's no, what I was told was that there's really no great measure of social deficit with people with autism spectrum disorder. So I want to see, okay, let's just do an initial study, right? So the kind of classic quasi-experimental or cross-sectional study, let's compare individuals who have ASD versus those who do not and see, do they exhibit a quote deficit, right? Or just simply differences compared to typically developed individuals on this issue. So in this study, our participants were 14 to 32 years old, largely a function of convenience, like who was available to do the study and make sure we had enough participants. Our 27 ASD individuals had a mean ADOS calibrated severity score 6.6, and then they were matched to 27 typically developed individuals who were matched on sex, so the number of males and females, and then mean matched on age, verbal IQ, nonverbal IQ, and full scale IQ. And in these individuals, both sets of individuals completed delayed discounting and social discounting tasks for hypothetical $100 outcomes, again, just to see would they be different. And here's the data. So what we see on the upper left here, so we're not showing the discount curve. We're just kind of showing the almost kind of like the indifference point data without any sort of model fitting. And what we see here is that individuals who are typically developing have lower rates of delayed discounting than individuals who have autism spectrum disorder. Simply, at a mean level, individuals with autism spectrum disorder were more likely to prefer the immediate outcome than the delayed outcome, and the TD individuals were more likely to choose the delayed outcome relative to the individual outcome. And this is kind of the pattern when we do these types of cross-sectional studies, and we're comparing people who engage in substance use versus who do not, people who have some relevant impulse control disorder versus not. So this is kind of what we tend to see with other behaviors. What we also saw is essentially a very similar pattern with the social discounting task. So individuals who are more who had autism spectrum disorder were more likely to choose the outcome for themselves rather than the outcome for the other individual, compared to typically developing individuals who are more likely to choose outcomes for the others relative to themselves. Okay, and so this is all a degree. It's not like the TD individuals were just completely altruistic and were willing to give, they just wanted the outcome for others. But if it was, if the outcome was, so for example, at partner one, they're basically saying if the choice is between, let's say, $100 for the person that I'm the closest to, person that I care about the most. If it's $100 for them versus $80 for myself, I'm kind of indifferent. Both are really good with me. That's basically what this is saying. And then you can see that as the person gets further and further away, this value decreases, which is what you would expect. But we do see that the ASD individuals had higher rates of social discounting, which would be consistent with theory, but beyond that, I'm not sure what it says, right? So it's nice that we observe that. But that's the premise. So that's the last of the autism spectrum disorder part of my data, right? But that's just to kind of lay the premise for some of this other work that we're doing that may be of interest to those of you who are not simply thinking about, how do you address autism spectrum disorder, how do you treat it, but what as a psychological phenomenon, what might be occurring, and what are the kind of novel targets that we can consider to address some of these deficits that you might not be thinking of. So how do we impact delay discounting? So one theory that I got really interested in about 50, maybe, I don't know, was construal level theory. So some of you may or may not be familiar with construal level theory. But I believe the original papers were published in the year early 2000s. And so yeah, 2003, I believe, was the first paper that I recall seeing by Trope and Lieberman, and they've published a number of papers since then. And the theory states this, that basically we have dimensions of psychological distance. So this is my best explanation of the theory. So we have dimensions of psychological distance. So what are those dimensions? Those dimensions could be temporal distance in the future, right? So how far something is going to happen in the future. That's one dimension of temporal distance, right? Another dimension of psychological distance is distance in the past. How long ago did something occur? Right? A dimension of psychological distance is geographic or spatial distance. How far something away is. It could be social distance. How close do you feel to these other people? It could be hypotheticality, right? The more fake and imaginary something is, that's another dimension of psychological distance. So the theory goes that there are all these dimensions of psychological distance, and when something is the way we operate as a default is that when something is psychologically proximal, close to us in terms of time, space, social distance, or reality, we tend to interpret things concretely, right? So if I were to ask you, what are you going to do after my talk today, right? You might say, I'm going to go grocery shopping, right? I'm going to have a drink because I need it after this talk, right? So you tend to, the answers tend to be very, very concrete and a low level of constraint, right? If I ask you, what are you going to be doing a year from now? Your answers are probably going to be something like, pursuing my dream, pursuing my career, raising a family. Those are very high level. Those are very abstract. And the idea here is that when you have these dimensions of psychological distance, and when something is psychologically proximal, we tend to think about things in terms of the concrete, the incidental level details of that event. And events are, when the psychological events are psychologically distal, they tend to be abstract, the essential features of the event, the high level. So that's the idea, is that we operate this way as a general rule. Okay. So that perfectly confounds, for example, a conventional delay discounting path, right? So is it possible that when we are asking people to choose between an outcome now versus an amount in the future, what we're asking fundamentally people to do is choose between a concrete event and an abstract event, right? The concrete event is now, the abstract event is in the future. So what I wanted to do this was explore the possibility that construal, is it concrete or is it abstract, might influence decision-making on something like delay discount. So I'll give you a couple of studies that we did. We initially tried to explore it, right? So if it is the case that priming abstract construal promotes preference for psychological distal outcomes, right? So because distal, psychologically distal means abstract. Psychologically proximal means concrete, right? So what if just generally we prime abstractness, right? Get you to think abstractly. Would that increase preference for the psychologically distal outcome? Because now you're primed to prefer abstract rather than.
Hello.
Hi,
Yes, okay.
can you answer a telephone call in just a second from Invista Credit Union? And they're gonna give you a code or authorize my access?
Yes, if they do it quickly.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hey, Bill, I think you're unmuted.
Hello, Bill Brooks
Hello.
here.
Hey, Bill?
This is Invista Credit Union.
We should not be hearing this.
Your 6-digit access code is 8.
Everybody cover their ears.
Go ahead and stop recording, Richard. This is a new experience.
Yeah.
Is
Okay, so return now. Okay, so that's the first study in this sequence, right? So what do we just prime people to be abstract? Will they prefer the delayed outcome? And then now that then we want to play with this a little bit, and I'll show you all the data after that. Is if it is the case, our default operating system is now is concrete, and the future is abstract, right? So if preference for immediacy and delayed discounting is indicative of preference for concrete. So in other words, maybe if people like immediate, not only because it's immediate, but because it's concrete, right? Then concrete construal of future outcomes should result in preference for future outcomes and preference in delayed discounting. So the folks who have been doing this work in the delayed discounting world in the last probably 3 or 4 years call this episodic future thinking, right? Which is we're getting people to think episodically or concretely about future events to see if that shifts preference for the future. Okay, and then the flip of that, right, is if people disprefer abstractness, right? So in other words, the reason people like now is because it's concrete, and they disprefer the future is because it's abstract, right? So if preference for immediacy and delayed discounting reflects this preference for abstractness, then if you create abstract construal of the immediate event, that should create this preference for that immediate event and preference for the delayed event and also reduce delayed discounting. So so that study 1 was abstract versus concrete. Study 2 was concrete future versus concrete present. So concrete present is the default. Concrete future would be the experimental condition. And then study 3 is abstract present versus abstract future, where abstract future is the default, right? And then the abstract present is our manipulation. And so without going through all of this point by point, essentially we found evidence in support of this idea, right? That that construal level theory, right, can be kind of exploited, I guess, or leveraged to frame outcomes in a way that shifts preference or the delayed outcome. Now, in all of these studies, what we did was a fully parametric repeated measures design. The one caveat to this observed effect is that there is an order effect. So what seems to happen is that when you expose individuals to what we would call here the experimental condition, right? So that's concrete future in study 2, and that's abstract in study 1, and that's abstract present in study 3, right? When that's the first condition that they experience, when they go through the second one, when they go back to the control condition, it doesn't fully undo the experimental condition. And what's interesting to me is that we see that exact same pattern across all 3 studies, right? Which is when you do the manipulation first, it has an effect, but it doesn't completely wash out the second time that you do it. And I will say that these sessions occurred a week apart. And this is all with college students. So, it could just be a weird order effect, but the fact that we're seeing the exact same pattern across the 3 studies gives me a little bit more confidence that what we're seeing here is the real thing. We could also integrate construal level theory to social discounting, right? So social discounting looks like some delayed discounting is instead of now versus later, it's self versus other. right? So the same principles should apply here. So we did a couple of studies. It's not the exact same sequence, right? Somewhat different question. But if it is the case that preference for the self in social discounting reflects a preference for concreteness, right? Then concrete construal of the other's outcome should result in decreased social discounting. And so I'm not talking about giving you lots of detail about exactly how we did the manipulation, but basically when we're doing concrete construal of the future or concrete construal of another person, what we're basically asking people is like, imagine that other person or imagine that time point in the future. And we ask them a lot of like really boring questions about the details, right? Like think about a day, think about a month from now, what are you wearing? What are you going to have for lunch? Right? Those kind of concrete type of priming questions to get them to think that way, as opposed to the abstract way, which is the way they're more likely to think. Okay? So this study one in social discounting kind of maps onto study 2 from the previous study, where we're getting people to think concretely about the other person and seeing if that shifts preference for that other person. Study 3, this is the one where this is not like any of the other ones, but the idea here is that these are dimensions of psychological distance, right? And so if you prime concrete construal of psychologically distal events, right, then the manipulation can be in one dimension of psychological distance, but the dependent measure can be in a different dimension of psychological distance. So in study 3, study 3 here, what we're doing, or it might be study 2, is so the question is, if preference for the self and social discounting reflects preference for concreteness, concrete construal of not of others, but of your own future should result in decreased social discounting. So in other words, what we're going to do is get you to think concretely about yourself in the future, right? But because what that's doing is creating concreteness of a psychologically distal event, social discounting should be decreased. So in other words, manipulating the construal level in one psychological dimension should also have effects in other dimensions of psychological distance. So we're going to manipulate it in terms of time, but it's going to have an effect in terms of social distance. So this results are, once again, eerily similar to what we observed in the studies in delayed discounting, which is we observe the effect, but only when, particularly in these examples, what we did was a fully parametric repeated measures design, right? But you see that effect only when they experience the experimental condition first, right? And it doesn't completely wash out when they go back to the control condition second, right? So once again, I'm seeing that kind of order effect always made me suspicious, but the consistency with which we're seeing that effect of seeing it in that first session, but not having it wash out in that second session, gives me a little bit more confidence that it's a real thing. So these are, I guess, our more recent applications of construal level theory to the study of delayed discounting and social discounting to see, to the extent that something like delayed discounting is associated with substance use, to the extent that something like delayed discounting might be predictive of clinical outcomes, right? Is this kind of, does this kind of light the pathway for some novel behavioral intervention targets in a way that we would not have typically thought about it, right? So how do we get people to think more about the future? Well, you get people to think about other people. How do you get people to think more about other people? You get them to think more about themselves in the future, right? That's not as intuitive, right? Although I suspect, in clinical practice, you do see some of those types of elements. Okay, so that's it related to our application of construal level theory or episodic thinking. Because I'm really interested in this overlap of temporal distance and interpersonal distance, there's some other stuff that I did when I was a grad student. I did some game theory stuff, prisoner's dilemma, that kind of started bleeding its way back into some of the work that we were doing. So we wanted to incorporate these insights from temporal and social overlap, consider altruism, self-control, and what is the impact of shared outcomes in something like delayed discounting. I like to tell this story because it just shows you where do people get their ideas. I don't know, right? So this is a book called Small World by David Lodge. If any of you have, so most of you have probably not heard of this, go get this book. It is awesome. it is basically a satire on academics, on us. Okay, now these are academics, these are English academics, and it's basically talks about how they crisscross the world going to these conferences are just like super curvy and inappropriate. And so if you know, I remember when the first time I ever went to a conference with a faculty member, I was like, wow, I can't believe you guys talk like this when you're around each other. So I love this book, and I would encourage you to read it because it is a really, really nice satire on the absurdity of some of the stuff that we do. But the reason I highlight that book is, number one, is to recommend that you read it. But I got the idea for this line of research when I was going to a conference. So I believe I was heading to a conference in Chicago, and I think it was 20. I forgot what year it was, but it was the year it was the year of the presidential election when Barack Obama was first elected. Okay, it was going up to that election, and I was reading an article in the Atlantic about how Barack Obama's campaign was so successful in getting people to donate money, right? And so what they said was, well, what they're doing is not saying, hey, can you give us $100 now, right? They're saying, hey, can you give us $10 every month for the next 10 months, right? Let's delay discounting, right? And they had a very, very high success rate of doing that, and now everybody does, right? So that got me thinking about, to the extent that donating to a cause is, altruism, right? I know it's not exactly, but to the extent that it's something like that, can we integrate this idea of social discounting and delayed discounting? So what we did in this study is, I landed at this conference. I talked to this guy that I know, I kind of knew, and I was like, hey, I have this idea. Do you want to do it? He was like, hell yes, let's do it. And then we just did a bunch of studies and led into these sequence of studies that really just came from me reading this article in the Atlantic. So the question is the behavior more altruistic when the outcome is delayed, right? So that's actually studying that phenomenon. And so what we did was we did a social discounting test. Do you want this amount for yourself now versus do you want this amount for somebody else, right? And then we imposed delays. So in other words, the outcomes are not going to happen right now. Do you want this amount for yourself in 6 months? Do you want that amount for the other person in 6 months? Do you want this amount for yourself in 12 months? Do you want this amount for this other person in 12 months? And we want to see if imposing those delays shifted social discounting. And what we observed is across 2 studies, it did, right? So when you impose a delay, people were more willing to give to the other than keep for themselves, right? Fundamentally, the choice was exactly the same, except for now there is a delay in terms of when the outcomes occur, right? Then what we want to do, so that's an example in which we looked at social discounting with an imposed delay. Now we did a study where we want to flip it around. Now we're going to look at social discounting, or delayed discounting, when some sort of social contact is in place. So in this study, what we did was we said, here's an out. Do you want this amount for this amount now versus this amount later? But we had a conditions in which we imposed social contact. So in other words, outcomes had to be shared. Do you want this amount for yourself and a group of other people versus do you want this delayed amount for yourself and the same group of other people? So if you're only thinking about yourself, the choice is exactly the same, right? So other people are going to get stuff, but whether you impose a social context or not, it's exactly the same. And so this is just a theory about what we would predict in mathematical theory. Don't worry about it. But we did a series of studies where you want X for yourself or Z for the other, or I'm sorry, delayed discounting for the self. Do you want delayed X for the self versus immediate Z for the self? And then we'll say we're going to multiply everything by 10, and it's going to be 10 people, and you're going to share equally. So it's the same choice if only you're thinking about yourself, right? We observed a shift when the contexts were being shared. People were more likely to choose the delayed outcome, even though the outcome to the individual was exactly the same. Then we said, well, maybe it's just because they're seeing different numbers, right? The numbers are bigger in the group context. So we had a condition where we did a regular delayed discounting task, and then instead of saying, here's this number multiplied by 10, and then split up, what we said was, here's that same number as in the individual, but it's for you and everybody else. So in other words, the numerical values end up being that identical. We still see a difference. It doesn't look as big here, but it is a significant difference. And then this is just another kind of like, this is a third control condition, almost like just to make sure that what we're seeing is not just a byproduct of the stimuli, right? The numbers that we're seeing, but again, we see the same effect. And then we can compare the delayed discounting for the self across the three conditions. Okay. And the theory would suggest that you should prefer like the middle condition, study 2, is the one where the numerical value is different, but studies 1 and 3 are identical. So you should see difference between study 2 and between 1 and 3, and we observe that effect here. And I know I'm not explaining the results very well, but trust me. Okay, and then we looked at the group context condition. These are the three. These are fundamentally all exactly the same. They're just presented differently, right? And we see that there is some difference. So in other words, it's not. So the results here is that the group context does have an effect. When there's shared outcomes, people are more likely to prefer the delayed outcome, even if the outcome for itself is exactly the same. However, it's not only that effect. There is something to the stimuli, the actual dollar value that individuals see. So it's both. My former collaborators at this time were at Virginia Tech. They took that idea, and instead of saying let's share both the immediate and delayed outcome, they said, what if we only shared the delayed outcome, right? So it's, do you want this for yourself versus do you want this in the future for yourself in another group? And they found this effect. So I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit further. So in this study, what we did was, so here our group was only group size 2 because the numbers were getting a little bit complicated. So we did it for group size 2, where only the delayed outcome is shared, right? So the immediate outcome is for yourself, the delayed outcome is shared. And so this is, so on the top, we have the conventional delayed discounting task. And on the left and the right, we have 2 versions of the shared outcome, right? And so this is where it's just a matter of presentation, what the stimuli look like. On the left, we just multiply that amount by 2 and say it's for you and this other person, you share equally. And on the right, we wanted to say, here's that $85 for you and for the other person. The idea is that the circles are the same size, but on the right, it's more clear, right? That you're getting half, whereas on the left, one could argue you have to do the math or whatever. The group context did shift preference for the delayed outcome, which is what was predicted, but we did not see, that's on the left, and on the right was the left versus the right on the bottom here, and we did not see a statistically significant difference. So at least for this first study, we did not see a difference between whether the outcomes were split for you or you had to split it up yourself. Then what we do was, well, let's see what happens when you ask people, do you want the immediate that's shared and the delayed is only for yourself? So in other words, does group context always make you prefer the delayed outcome, or does group context make you prefer the group context item? And so we basically flipped that around and we said, now the delayed outcome is always for yourself, right? But the immediate outcome is for you and the others on the bottom left, or you and the other, each of you getting that same amount, right? And what we observed was a flip, right? So the group context resulted in preference for the immediate outcome, right? So the take-home message of that would be that individuals' preference tracks towards the outcome that is shared. It doesn't always result in preference for the delayed outcome. And in this study, we did see a statistically significant difference between the split outcome versus the not split outcome. So what's the take-home message of that? We replicated the group context effect from that particular study that I showed earlier. It shows there's indication that the group context effect is not due to the magnet effect. Don't worry about that. Indication that preference in delayed discounting tracks with the shared outcome. Right? So people seem to prefer the shared outcome, even if it makes no difference in terms of what they get. Right? And in all of these conditions, we did not specify who the other person was. We didn't say your best friend. It was an unidentified vague others. We have done a series of studies where we asked people to imagine that it was people that they liked or they didn't like, their best friend, their worst enemy. I'm not showing that data here because it's too much. And then there's mixed evidence that sharing that showing shared outcomes represents presented impacts for discounting. So how you show whether the outcomes are shared or not is seems to impact discounting. So I have no delicate ending for this. So I'm just going to stop here and just acknowledge all the people that contributed to the work. I'll tell you, Matt, you might experience this as well. I don't consider myself that old yet, although I feel it. But what's super cool as I was making up this list is, so these are all co-authors on the papers that I presented to you today. And I would say almost half of these people did not have their PhD when I was working. That's pretty cool. That many of the people end up, getting their degrees and probably going to be way more successful and probably be my boss someday. But it's a cool feeling to see that, and I'm adding PhDs as I'm adding these names. Like, yeah, this person has a PhD now. This person has a PhD. So, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. That was awesome. Yeah. So I do consider myself old, just to be clear, but yeah, I'm with you. That experience of seeing PhDs get added to names it's one of the coolest parts of what we do. That was a lot of data.
It was awesome.
A lot, and it was awesome. And so I appreciate you sharing with it. I want to open it up to questions from everyone, but I did want to just clarify sort of one fundamental thing. As someone who knows of delayed discounting and feels his head spin a little bit every time, I have to wrap my brain around this concept, and especially when you went into construal theory, which I found fascinating. When we talk about delayed discounting, like in the context of addiction research, how much of this is a true trait versus stimulus dependent? In other words, because I'm thinking about this from like a rehab perspective, like, is someone who is addicted to, drug A, do they show a differential, I forget what you called it, but the discounting slope for drug A versus money or for other stimuli? So you just answer that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, that's something on some level that I think the field is somewhat grappling with. I think part of it is due to the fact that I think there's a lot of kind of people doing work in the clinical domain who don't have a kind of a strong foundation in kind of what is delayed discounting, what's the history from which that literature developed, and so they think about it as if it's a like a clinical measure, right? Yeah. I do not think it's a clinical measure. In fact, I think its utility as a clinical measure is very, very limited. Yes, there's some evidence that suggests that it's predictive of treatment outcomes, right? Fine, but it's not accounting for huge portions of that variance, right? I think its true value is to drive theory that can inform our understanding of something like substitute theory. So it's highly, the discount rate that you get is highly variable depending on task, right? So whether you use one type of money task versus a different type of money task, you get different discount rates, right? Now, relative rank ordering across different tasks might be the same for a specific individual, right? So there might be some reliability related to that, right? But they vary. And then when you say, okay, well, what's the commodity? So instead of money, right? What if it's a drug, or if it's food, or if it's anything else that can have real reinforcing efficacy, right? What does that mean when you see those shifts, right? I think that there's theoretical insights to be gained from understanding that, but I think its clinical utility is very limited. As it relates to the question of whether is it a trait, everything is kind of a trait kind of environment, right? I will tell you what I think it is, and to the extent that our delayed discounting task picked up something, right? I think what you're doing is picking up more of a state-like factor related to what's that person's valuation of future outcomes at the moment, right? What I think is happening is that I think it's what some people might call a modifiable trait or a relatively fixed state. So I think that a big thing that drives the discounting rate is kind of like, what's the environment that you live in? How volatile is your environment? How predictable is your environment? And the reality is that for most people in the real world, the reliability of their environment is fairly constant, right? So for me, today, tomorrow, a year from now, it's relatively steady in terms of how reliable my environment is, right? Whereas, for example, we've been doing study in Baltimore, Maryland for 9 years now, right? And they live in it's a very low SES community, primarily African American, many individuals homeless, right? Their environment is fairly constant, right? In that it's consistently unpredictable. Everything takes a lot of psychological research, right? And so, if you measure those folks over and over time, right, you might see something that's fairly constant. But it's not because it's I would say it's not because it's like a trait variable, although there are trait-like elements, right? But it's because their environment is fairly consistent in that domain. Right? And there's some work that I'm doing with some folks over in Detroit right now, where we're looking at this, and what we are is finding that like a child's rate of delayed discounting seems to be responsive to the predictability of the parent and the environment in which they live. And then you can see how that kind of translates as they grow up, right? So in a way, it kind of makes sense, right? And just because something makes sense intuitively doesn't mean that it's right, right? But if you live in a highly volatile environment, right, it kind of makes sense not to be thinking too much about the future, right? Why would you? You don't know if you're going to make it, right? The example that I use in like my kind of more public audience studies talk is that, you know what, if you were thinking, I want to have a drink after work today, right? Well, what if I told you tomorrow might not come? An asteroid is coming and it's going to blow everything up, right? How many drinks are you going to have? If you said, I'm just going to have one and I'm good, I would say you are irrational. I would say you should load up. If you like drinking, have some drinks, right? And I think that is a big part. So I know it's a little bit of a soapbox answer. That's not exactly what you're asking now, but that is, I think what happens is lots of folks use these measures of delayed discounting in a way that I think that they really shouldn't be. And that ends up resulting in these questions about like, well, what does it mean when you get different discount rates for different tasks and different commodities? I think that shouldn't be the first for what folks were trying to do this work in the code of the language.
Interesting. All right. Well, let me open it up to that. Honestly, sparked a few other questions, but I want to open it up to the rest of the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand virtually and unmute yourself if you have questions. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat though before mine. I don't want to jump ahead. I don't want to cut the
I was just getting ready to mention that. Christine said she can't turn her camera on because she's got a little bit of chaos going on in the background, but she asked if we could revisit the idea of how this could be applied to the ASD population that you mentioned, that it's a possible predictive measure, but how do you see it fitting in at all with treatment, or do you see it more purely as theoretical?
So, I mean, so two things. So if it is correct, right, like I said, this is just from my conversations with some folks who do work in the area from 5-6 years ago, which is that if it is the case that there aren't really any great measures of social deficit in autism spectrum disorder, right? Could a social discounting task be one, right? The value of something like that is that if it is the case that it can be valuable, I'm not saying that it's a comprehensive measure of social, right? But if it's picking up on some portion of it, right? One of the challenges with interventions for anything, right, is that to really test it, kind of the model in NIH has been, develop an intervention and then, do a pilot trial or do a stage 2 trial, right? And that's a lot of resources that you're investing into exploring research questions. And there is now this emphasis, which I think is appropriately so, is identifying target mechanisms right? And so these new, and not new, but like these more common NIH mechanisms where you see now like the U mechanism or something like that, they're saying do a short study instead of asking for 5 years of money to to recruit 500 people for an intervention that might not work at all, right? Spend 1 or 2 years identifying a target identify a target mechanism, right? And see, does your intervention treat that target mechanism? Because then if it does, and if that target mechanism is associated with current outcomes, then at least you have like a bridge that suggests, you know what, there's good reason to move on, right? So, do I think that something like a social discounting task is going to be like a gold standard measure of social deficit? No way. It is far too simplistic. It's only capturing, if it's capturing anything, it's only capturing a small slice of something, right? And my suspicion is that social deficit is way more complicated than, hey, do you think about this other person, right? But to the extent that this picks up on some of it, right? What it could be is kind of an early indicator of whether some treatment does that, right? So, for example, is it possible that we can come up with something informed by control level theory, right? That says, well, you know what? We see a certain type of social deficit in autism spectrum disorder, right? What does control level theory about that? Can we come up with something that might move the needle on that issue? And then the way we might detect it is something like a social discounting. And if it shows some signal there, that's the premise by which we say, okay, let's develop a more fully developed intervention and see if it works. So I kind of see it perhaps, right? And that's like the best case scenario if it has any use at all in that domain. But that is one scenario which I can.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Rebecca, you had the next question.
Yeah, it's kind of going back to Matt's question. I was curious if any of this has been tested like within addictions population. So instead of money, it's drug A.
Yeah.
And if you still see that transfer effect, still appearing within a week,
Yeah.
like do you see effects of like reduced use, for example?
Yeah. So there is, for example, the episodic future thinking, the control level theory stuff, there is some early indications. So people are trying to develop some interventions around that right now. And for example, I was just on the study section where there's a R34 application. I couldn't review it, without conflict, but I'm aware of that, and we're about to submit an R34 application where we're trying to deliver this control level theory or episodic future thinking using art, right? Getting people to do art because it's so visual, right? Makes perfect sense to me. I hope the reviewers feel the same way. I got distracted there on the problem with, so we've actually published some recent kind of review and theoretical papers and some empirical papers on this idea of delayed discounting of drugs. The problem, as I see it, of delayed discounting of drugs. The thing about money is that like it has the economic quality of liquidity, right? It can be exchanged for anything, so you can ascribe meaning to it. With something like consumable commodities like drugs, it's difficult, right? And the argument that I propose is that when you ask people to make a choice between drug now versus drug later, right? So, for example, as a type of translating that past into a drug commodity, is ask anyone, right, who is misusing opioids or even smoking cigarettes and say, hey, 5 years from now, are you going to be a smoker? 5 years from now, are you still going to be using opioids? Right? I would say almost universally, right? It's very unusual for like a regular heavy smoker to be like, oh, I love smoking. I'm just going to keep on doing it forever, right? Everybody sees themselves as quitting. The challenge with those, do you want drug now versus drug later tests is that if people prefer the immediate, you don't know it's because they prefer the immediate or they disprefer the delayed, right? They don't want the drugs 5 years from now because they expect to not use them, right? So that's where there's some utility of these what are called cross commodity tests. We're choosing between drug now and money later, or money now versus drug later. And if you do a parametric combination of those, you're able to kind of disentangle, do you prefer the drug versus what's the temporal component? Whereas if you just do drug now versus drug later by itself, it's really difficult to find out, is it because they just have to have the drug now, or is it because they just don't want the drug in the future?
Rich, I see we're at time, actually just a few minutes past, and it certainly is my sense that we could have this conversation for a lot longer. So I want to thank you for doing the talk, and also just publicly invite you or others from your center to join these talks at any point. And also if others, your colleagues, are interested in presenting, we'd love to have them, because I really think that you just come about these questions from, like, they're overlapping questions maybe, but from a very different perspective. And it just really makes for great conversation, and it motivates a lot of new ideas. So I appreciate that, but would love to continue this dialogue as well. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So appreciate the talk. We'll end it here. Thanks again to our speaker and for everyone for joining, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care.